We now ask the survivors and their families to light the memorial candles. Lighting the first candle, Eva Grinston and her son John. Eva and John light this candle in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. Lighting the next candle, Paul Drexler and his daughters, Julie Drexler and Michelle Levitt. Paul was born in Spachinca, Czechoslovakia on June 29, 1938. In September 1944, having been in hiding, Paul and his family were arrested and taken to Sered transit camp, where he and his mother were then sent to Theresienstadt, from which they were liberated on May 8, 1945. Paul has written a book on his experience titled In Search of My Father. Paul, Julie and Michelle light this candle in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. Lighting the next candle, Ibi Wertheim and her grandson Jonathan. Ibi and Jonathan light this candle in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. Lighting the next candle, Charles Feldman and his son Bart and daughter Romy. Charles was born in Paris in 1937. After his father was sent to Auschwitz, never to be heard from again, the family avoided deportation, being protected by the caretaker of their building and then a Jewish organisation. Subsequently, Charles and his sister Jacqueline were hidden in a number of orphanages until the end of the war, when they were reunited with their mother. Charles and Bart light this candle in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. Lighting the next candle, Flor Jacku with her grandchildren, Danielle Jacku Greenfield and Mark Jacku. Flor, Danielle and Mark light this candle in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. Lighting the final candle, Yvonne Doff and Rebecca Grinblatt, in memory of their mother and grandmother, Marika Weinberger, OAM. Yvonne and Rebecca light this candle in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. The personal histories of the survivors who were not read out now will be presented in more detail later in the program.
Dear survivors, learned rabbis, distinguished guests, representatives of Jewish organisations and friends, welcome to this annual commemoration of Yom HaShoah organised by the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. Before continuing, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of myself and the speakers who follow that this evening we gather on the traditional lands of the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge and give thanks to the elders and traditional owners who have cared for this land for thousands of years. We offer respect to the First Peoples who live now in the community and whose presence and cultures are vital to our nation. May we walk with care on this land that sustains their spirit and which has provided a home for our Jewish community. We are honoured to have many distinguished guests here with us this evening. Please forgive me if time constraints preclude me from welcoming you all personally by name. They include His Excellency, Mr. Shmuel Ben Shmuel, Ambassador of Israel, and the Embassy's Acting Deputy Chief of Mission, Ms. Einat Weiss. Our keynote speaker, the Honourable Josh Frydenberg MP, Federal Assistant Treasurer, who will be properly introduced later. Senator the Honourable Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Social Services. The Honourable Philip Ruddock, MP. The Honourable Gladys Berejiklian MP, Treasurer and Minister for Industrial Relations. The Honourable David Elliott MP, Minister for Corrections, Emergency Services and Veterans Affairs. The Honourable David Clark, MLC, Parliamentary Secretary for Justice. The Honourable Catherine Cusack, MLC, Parliamentary Secretary for Tertiary Education and Skills. Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile, MLC. Mr. Alistair Henskins, SC MP. Consuls General and other consular representatives from Argentina, Austria, Brazil, Britain, the People's Republic of China, Croatia, the Czech Republic, the Federal Republic of Germany, Greece, Ireland, Latvia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Portugal, Romania, the Russian Federation, Republic of Serbia, Sierra Leone, Spain, and the United States. Dr. Tim Sutphamassan, Race Discrimination Commissioner. Mr. Warren Mundine, Chairman of the Australian Government's Indigenous Advisory Council. Mayors and councillors from City of Canada Bay, Hornsby Shire, Ku-ring-gai, Leichhardt, North Sydney, Parramatta City, City of Sydney, Waverley and Woollahra. Mr. Robert Goot, AM, SC, President of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Mr. Peter Wayne, President of the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants. Representatives of New South Wales Police and more than 70 representatives of NGOs, academic and educational institutions, and our partners of other faiths, ethnic communities, cultures and traditions. This year we commemorate 70 years since liberation. The concentration camps were liberated by the Allied and Soviet forces between 1944 and 1945. The first major camp, Majdanek, was discovered by the advancing Soviets on the 23rd of July 1944. Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th of January 1945 and Buchenwald by the Americans on the 11th of April. The British liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April. And so it went. Colonel William W. Quinn of the United States 7th Army said of Dachau, "There our troops found sights, sounds and stenches horrible beyond belief, cruelties so enormous as to be incomprehensible to the normal mind." However, liberation encompassed much more than just the freeing of concentration camp inmates. Jews in ghettos, those in hiding, those living under false identities, those with the partisans in the forests, and all Jews who had lived under Nazi occupation and the terror which that entailed, experienced liberation with the arrival of the Allied forces and the end of World War II. This should have been a time of unbridled joy, but for many it was a time of crisis, emptiness, and overwhelming loneliness, as they realised the scale of destruction on both a personal and communal level. At war's end, it became apparent that some 6 million Jews had been murdered, about 1/3 of world Jewry. The overwhelming majority of survivors took no revenge on the Germans, but set out on a path of rehabilitation, rebuilding and creativity, while commemorating the world that no longer existed. And this was no more evident than here in this wonderful country, Australia, which welcomed so many of them. We remember those survivors who have since passed away by means of the campaign initiated for the first time this year, entitled Their Names Survive, listing some of their names and photos on the screen at the beginning of this commemoration, and by recounting the story of one of them. I now invite Rebecca Grinblatt to speak to us about her highly esteemed grandmother, Marika Weinberger, who passed away only recently.
The name Marika Weinberger is one that is known to almost everyone here. From the early 1990s until her retirement, hers was the voice in New South Wales of Holocaust survivors. How did the child of a comfortable, middle-class Jewish family in Czechoslovakia become the political activist that most of you remember? She was born in 1928 in the newly created Republic of Czechoslovakia, which carried the hopes of its citizens for a democratic and inclusive polity. Unfortunately, those hopes were dashed when Germany, under the Nazi government, embarked on a program of expansion and exclusion. For Marika and her family, the Holocaust began long before they were transported. In 1939, their hometown of Košice was annexed by Hungary, which had already enacted restrictions against the Jews. Marika was no longer permitted to attend a public school. Her father was forced out of work. Her mother was not allowed to shop in the market until after 10 o'clock, when of course the traders had nothing left to sell. Her parents were desperate to maintain her schooling, so she was enrolled at double fees in a Catholic college and also attended a privately run Jewish school for Hebrew. Nevertheless, her hopes of studying medicine were dashed forever. The adults around Marika tried to ensure that her life continued with as little interruption as possible, but each turn of the screw, each new law designed to isolate and humiliate the Jews, moulded a woman who would fight for justice. Despite her beliefs and her feistiness, Marika, like all the European Jews, was powerless. In August 1941, all but 2 members of her mother's family were deported to Kamenets-Podolsk, where they were murdered. Had Marika's father not obtained forged Hungarian citizenship papers for their family, they would also have perished. Marika's father was conscripted for labour, but was posted to local work and so remained with his family. On the second day of Pesach, 1944, they were forced to leave their home and move into the ghetto, where they remained until mid-May. On Friday, the 2nd of June, the family was loaded into a rail wagon, together with Marika's 2 grandmothers and her maternal aunt, Olga. After some days, they reached Auschwitz, where they were separated. Marika never saw her father, Bela, again. The women went through a selection on the platform. Marika's last view of her mother, Irene, was as she walked away, supporting her mother, Irma, on one arm, and her mother-in-law, Esther, on the other arm. Marika and her sister Dutsi were left with their aunt, Olga, and the trio remained together. Their stay in Auschwitz was mercifully short. They were sent to work at Kaiserwald camp near Riga. In August 1944, in the face of the Russian advance, they were evacuated on open barges to Glöwen, a satellite camp of Sachsenhausen. It was here that she stood in falling snow with the other female prisoners, wearing only their thin canvas uniforms, some with shoes, none with underwear, to sing Christmas carols for the SS officers who were enjoying a Christmas party inside. In April 1945, they were marched first to Ravensbrück and then Malkov, where they were liberated by the Russians on the 2nd of May 1945. Marika was fortunate that she and her sister returned home to the care of Olga and to the one surviving paternal uncle, Peter Zira. A fellow prisoner, Margit, brought her cousin Alex to meet Marika, and they married on the 24th of March 1946. In August 1947, Marika left by train for Paris, where Alex's brothers, Harry and George, were already living. Alex joined them 6 weeks later as he had to sneak across the border through Germany. They waited 2 years for permits to join Alex's sister Muncie and brother George in Australia, during which time their daughter Kathy was born. Like most migrants, they threw themselves into establishing their place in their new homeland. Marika remained at home where, despite her youth, she acted as a surrogate mother or older sister to a number of single Jewish boarders, all survivors. Marika was always grateful for the open and warm welcome they received from their Australian neighbours in Brisbane, who even threw them a surprise party to celebrate their naturalisation. During this time, Marika and Alex produced a second child, Yvonne, an Aussie girl. In 1963, the family settled in Sydney, and Marika was fully occupied in the world of work. My earliest memories of Oma are of her running her shop, serving customers, keeping displays perfect and stylish. And despite the many hours she spent at work, her greatest pride was in keeping a Jewish home, making an occasion of every Shabbat and Yom Tov, with beautiful table linens, her finest cutlery and dinnerware. At her table, Oma expressed her traditions and attachments. Her wonderful cholent was always followed by lamingtons. Oma joined the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants in 1985. She quickly joined the board and in 1990 was elected president, where she raised the profile of the association. Because she was articulate and abreast of current affairs, she became the go-to person for local news media on issues that convulsed Australian society, such as stolen generation, treatment of refugees, and the unfortunate emergence of racism in Australian politics. She always spoke from her own experience of injustice and her determination that it should not prevail in Australian society. In her role with the association, she was intimately connected with the establishment of the Sydney Jewish Museum, and when the association's office moved to the museum, she was there every day, working alongside the other volunteers who became her extended family. Oma brought a formality and order to her work. Because she was dealing in matters of Holocaust remembrance, she approached her work with gravitas. She needed to do right by all those she represented, the survivors who needed an advocate and the dead who could not speak for themselves. She expected people to work extremely hard and had little tolerance for time wasters on her committees. She did not hold back. If she disagreed with a person's idea or their conduct, she was quick to let them know. She was a formidable woman. She was also extremely loyal and would fight for you if she believed you were right. Oma always remained true to her roots. Her parents' example of charity, community participation, and Jewish observance were the template for her own life. She, in turn, modelled these values for her own children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and wider family, and we're all very proud of her.
I was born in Salonika on the 28th of September 1923 from a mother born in Istanbul and a father born in Salonika as well. At home, older people spoke Ladino and younger people spoke French. We left Salonika for some economic reasons. I had an uncle, he went to France and was living in Toulon first, and after went to live in Brussels. After that, my grandfather followed, and of course, after my grandfather, we followed. On the 10th of May, 1940, the Germans enter Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. One day, two men from the Jewish community came in our shop and presented me with a long list of things to take to the assembling point for the Jews before deportation to Germany. I went to the office and told my boss. He said, "You are not going anywhere. And this man brought an empty identity card, a Belgian card that he had stolen, a genuine card. And they told me, how do you want to be called? I was so haunted by the idea of Jews and Christians that automatically I said Christiane de la Croix, and nobody laughed. Mr. Peter said René Michiels, who was a colleague, I didn't know he was in the resistance, will come to pick you up because we took tickets for you for the night train to Paris. We had decided between us that if we were interrogated, we would pretend that we eloped. So suddenly, at one stop, the Gestapo comes on the train and start checking the papers. They keep the identity card of René, and then they take mine, and they keep it as well. Then he takes my hand, and I know how stupid it may sound, but in my fear, I thought he might see I'm Jewish in my hand. He looked at me, and I kept that feeling that the guy had recognized me as a Jewess. He gave me back my paper, and to René his. He first asked, Jude? I said, me? No. And that was it. Sometimes tragic moments, when you are living them, you just go ahead and do them, which is wonderful. It's like a miracle that you allow yourself to remain quiet without any effort. I'm not a hero. It just all went smoothly, and it continued. It must have been about September or October 1944. Eventually, the liberation came. And they were saying that de Gaulle was going to march on the Champs-Élysées. And of course, nobody wanted to miss that. My cousin Freddie and myself went that day, and we were talking to the liberators. They were French and American and Spanish, and laughing and be so happy. And suddenly, we heard some gunshot. It was the collaborators shooting at us. And for a second, I thought, Flore, you must be stupid. You went through the whole war, and you're going to die here in a minute. And thank God it stopped, or they caught them, and everything went smooth after that. We saw de Gaulle, and we shouted, and we cried and sang, and it was so wonderful. Of course, after that, things were pretty fast. All I could think of is to go to the authorities and get some papers in my real name this time. When my mother saw me, she was not speaking French. She was suddenly speaking Spanish. She, in her emotion, she would speak Ladino. Well, I went back to my old job in the office of the people repatriated. I used to watch when I saw Jewish people coming in. One day, a man came in. It was my future husband, Eddie, and we called the people from concentration camp the prisoners. So I asked, Eddie, and what are you going to do now? He said, I've got a permit to go to Australia. And he said, would you like to come with me? Very flirt. So I said, why not? Anyway, when they left, I said to the others, what do you think? A prisoner asked me to go with him in Australia, and everyone laughed, of course. The Joint, which was the welfare society, helped all the people in need, that was mainly people who had been in camp, and pay the trip to Australia. The ship was called the Suriento. In Perth, we met the envoy of the Welfare Society to explain a little bit to us how life would be in Australia. He said something which touched me a lot. He said, when you hear a noise in the morning, it'll be the milkman, not the Gestapo. So,
Please rise. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, bi'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevorach le'alam olmei olmaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnasei, Vitadar, Vitale, Vitalal, Shmei de Kudesha, Brichu, Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru, Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. El malei rachamim, shochein b'amromim, hametzei menucha nechona, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. לנשמות ששת מיליוני אחינו ואחיותינו בני ישראל שנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנתברו חיים על ידי הנאצים ועוזריהם ימח שמם ומסרו נפשם על קידוש השם בעבור שאנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו ושלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
Last week, we celebrated the festival of Pesach, or Passover, a festival where we reenact rituals that Jews have reenacted for thousands of years. And why do we do this? Because through these important rituals and recollections, we ensure that the suffering and pain of our people as slaves will be remembered for centuries to come. When it comes to Pesach, we are a link in a chain of memory that stretches thousands of years. We link past remembrances to future observance. That is our responsibility. But when it comes to the Shoah, our responsibility is different. We are not a mere link in the chain of memory. We are instead charged with creating a new chain of remembrance that stretches into perpetuity. Creating rituals of remembrance is a responsibility that has fallen on the shoulders of only a few generations of our people, and it now falls on ours. Just like the generation who established the Seder or the rituals of Tisha B'Av. We are all here tonight because we understand that responsibility. Tonight we not only recall 70 years since liberation, but we also recognise the incredible feats of those survivors who were responsible for the rebirth of our people. We owe so much to that generation who absorbed the horror of their experience and created for us wonderful, warm, safe homes and lives. It's an incredible feat. I always thought that the greatest gift my grandparents gave to our family was a life in which the horrors of the Shoah were completely beyond our comprehension. That they fought so very hard to ensure we received the gift of normality. It was their burden to carry. Well, it is now time for us to take over the burden of this remembrance, and it leads us to our very special guest speaker this evening. Our keynote speaker is the Honourable Josh Frydenberg, Assistant Treasurer and member for Kuyong. He was sent to Poland this year as the Australian Government representative at the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Graduating from Mount Scopus College and Bialik in Melbourne, Mr. Frydenberg acquired a Bachelor of Law and Economics in Honours, followed by a Master's in International Relations from Oxford and a Master's in Public Administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard. Last December, he was sworn in as Assistant Treasurer. After Mr. Frydenberg's keynote address, we will play a short video, and then the Ambassador for Israel, His Excellency Shmuel Ben Shmuel, will make a presentation on behalf of Yad Vashem to award the honour of Righteous Among the Nations to a member of an Australian family. Friends, please welcome the Honourable Josh Frydenberg.
The Ambassador of Israel, Shmuel Ben Shmuel, members of the Diplomatic Corps, parliamentary colleagues from the Federal Parliament, Connie Favanti-Wells and Philip Ruddock, from the State Parliament, led by the Treasurer of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, and the Board of Deputies, and ladies and gentlemen, but most importantly, the survivors of the Shoah who are here with us today. On the 27th of January this year, there was a remarkable moment. It was dark, it was cold, it was snowing, and there was silence. And more than 50 leaders from the nations of the world were walking along the railway track at Auschwitz-Birkenau for more than 1.5 kilometres. Their destination was a monument where they lit a light in memory of the surrounding dead. And they also came to commemorate a moment where good triumphed over evil, and the most brutal, most efficient killing machine the world has ever seen was brought to an end with the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. But it was not before more than 10 million innocent people had lost their lives, including 6 million of our fellow Jews, 1.5 million of whom were children. My personal story and my personal history is no different to many of you in this room. It represents just one family, Jewish family, with their origins in Europe. I lost 2 great-grandparents at Auschwitz and 3 great-aunts, all of whom were shot as they came off the cattle carts at Auschwitz. My wife's grandmother, herself a survivor of Auschwitz, lost both her parents and 9 siblings. My wife's grandfather lost his mother and 8 siblings at Auschwitz. So you can understand that it was with some trepidation that I went for the first time myself to Auschwitz, to this horrible, horrible place. And what struck me was how ordered everything was, even so long after the event. The accommodation barracks, the workshops, and of course, the crematorium. At Auschwitz, more than 1 million people lost their lives, 90% of whom were Jewish, but there was also Roma, political prisoners from Russia and from Poland, people who were disabled, people who were homosexual, all lost their lives at the hands of the Nazis at Auschwitz. As I walked through those gates, Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. I had voices from my past flooding through my head. Because when people walk through that gate, somebody would choose whether they lived or whether they died. For those that were to die, they went to the crematorium. And when you walk into that room, you see a little hole in the ceiling from where the gas canisters fell. And even to this moment, you can see the marks from the victims' fingernails as they were scratching for their last grasp of breath. And next to the gas chambers are these industrial-size ovens where the Sonderkommando, our fellow Jew, was asked to wheel their fellow Jew into these ovens, which burnt day and night, bringing the stench of death to the air all around it. For those who were put into the column where they would live, albeit temporarily, the Nazis had other plans. At Auschwitz, you can see rooms full of shoes taken from the victims, artificial limbs, the gold from their teeth, the pots and the pans they brought thinking that they were coming to a new life. And the most confronting thing I saw was a room full of human hair used to make pillows for the Nazis, if ever there was a reminder that our fellow Jews had all their dignity stripped from them and were made to just be a number. And I looked at all of this, and I can tell you, I did not feel anger. I felt empty. I asked myself the question, how did a cultured people such as the Germans, who had produced Bach, Mozart and Weber, descend so low? How did they lose their humanity? How did they lose any sense of love for their fellow man? And how did the rest of the world let this happen? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is because of indifference. It's indifference that allowed this to happen. And nothing expresses it better than the words of that Lutheran pastor and German theologian, Martin Niemöller, himself originally a supporter of the Nazis, who then became its victim. He said, first, they came for the socialists. I did not say anything because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I said nothing because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jew, and I said nothing because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. So I attended this special commemorative service at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There were more than 3,000 people in attendance. 10 years ago, at the 60th anniversary, there were 1,500 survivors who were present. This year, there were only 300 survivors, with the question on everybody's lips, in a decade's time, will there be any survivors at all? And the survivors who spoke sent us all a very powerful message. In their words, they said the Shoah, the Holocaust, is a scar on living memory. They describe the past as being the present. And in the words of Raymond Kent, a survivor, he told us all, "Don't let my past be my child's future." And this event at Auschwitz-Birkenau was occurring after the backdrop of the events in Paris, where innocent Jews were killed in the kosher supermarket. And the rising tide of anti-Semitism spreading throughout Europe. And so there was a very, very urgent message for us that we can't let it happen again. It has to be said and acknowledged that despite all the atrocities of the Holocaust, Germany has confronted its past. It has outlawed Holocaust denialism. It has reached out to Israel. And in the words of the German President Joachim Gauck, there is no German identity without the Holocaust. And for me, it was particularly poignant that at Auschwitz-Birkenau, 15 years ago, 400,000 people would visit each year. Today, it's 1.5 million, 70% of whom are under the age of 25. And this is why those young people who visit, and everybody in this auditorium, regardless of religion or background, has a collective responsibility. General Dwight Eisenhower, subsequently a US president, then the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, upon coming to one of the liberated concentration camps and seeing the atrocities with his own eyes, said famously, "There would come a time in the world when people would deny that these atrocities ever took place." So what Eisenhower said and what Eisenhower did was that he brought politicians and journalists and civilian leaders from around the world to those concentration camps to bear witness to what had happened. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is our responsibility. Today as much as yesterday, tomorrow more than today. I want to finish with a quote from Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel said, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of religion is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference." And when we were at Auschwitz-Birkenau for the 70th anniversary of the commemoration of that horrible place, the survivors told us that they honour the dead by living, not crying. Ladies and gentlemen, we the lucky ones who were spared the atrocities of the Second World War and the horrors of the concentration camp. We honour the dead by saying never again.
It was dark, and we noticed there was a tremendous lot of activity in the streets, which meant that that night something was happening. There was a tremendous noise around the building, and a battery of German SS soldiers turned up and said, I knew they were there, and they found us. We were put into a railway carriage and then taken to the unknown, arriving at the gate, which you probably all saw, which said Arbeit macht frei. We were in Auschwitz. My sister and I waited till the doors were opened, quite sure that this was the best chance we had to meet with Mother. My sister was told to go to the left, I was told to go to the right. I grabbed her hand, held on to her for sweet life. It didn't help. The man who was in charge of the duty of selection of who was to live and die saw me hanging on to her and said, let her go, she'll go to school. And I said, I want to go to school too. And he said, no, you'll go somewhere else, you're bigger. And my sister again listened to his command to leave me. And he just turned to her and said the magic words, go on, little one, go on, you'll go to Palestina. Well, for a little girl that was dreaming of being reunited with her father, that was just the sort of glockenspiel that she wanted to hear. And she ran as fast as she could away from me. At that stage, I had no idea how dreadful the man's psychology was towards this innocent little child. My sister was pushed to the left, and I never saw her again.
But I was also in Auschwitz, as you know, and from there I was around about 6 weeks there. From there I went to a Arbeitslager, workers' lager. We were cleaning rubbles all the time because that area was bombed constantly. Eventually we were bombed too. We lost a lot of our girls. And it was September, it was actually Rosh Hashanah. We were taken from Gersenberg to Thüringen, where we were working in an ammunition factory. There we had even a bunker. Previously we had nothing. But eventually we had to leave the camp from 1 minute to the other. And then we started to march. And we were marching for weeks and weeks. All the roadways littered with burned tanks and trucks and bodies, and we just marched. We had to march 25 to 30 kilometers per day, which was very, very hard, especially my poor sister, who had to march with a wooden clock, 30 kilometers per day. It was terrible. I can still hear her wooden clock, how it clapped on the roadway.
I must admit, by that time I couldn't anymore face marching. I didn't realize that I had typhoid. I was very weak, and I decided I'm staying. I don't want any more. And I hid in the camp. I must have fallen asleep, and I suddenly heard a male footstep, opened my eyes and saw a pair of bow legs in uniform above my head. in the gutter where I was hiding. I couldn't believe it, but they were there, our liberators.
While we were marching on the main road towards a fairly large city, Glauchau it was, the roadway was fairly high up, very wide, and on both sides of the road we had ditches, very deep ditches, and all of a sudden while we were marching, we could hear tanks from a distance rumbling that was behind us. And in front of us, we heard the same thing and shooting. Actually, the SS woman was calling out to us, quickly go down to the ditches, which we did. And that's the last time I saw her. She disappeared. And it was already sundown. So we just crawled on our tummy to a nearby factory, which was a leather factory. And we took shelter. I think my sister took her wooden clock down and broke the window to get into that place. And we stayed there until we were liberated by the Americans.
I can't remember much for a few days because I was very ill. When I came to, I was in barracks that had been occupied by the German soldiers before me. There was the Russian army doctor who happened to be Jewish and was extremely helpful and made absolutely sure that I didn't fall victim to all the care parcels that were there. The Russian doctor who looked after me told me that that would kill me, to just have cabbage, boiled cabbage, and that was the way they saved me.
We just couldn't believe it. We said, where are the Germans? And they said, oh, they're all gone. They fled. You are free, you are free. We still didn't believe it. We stayed there for quite a while before we could start going back and hoping that perhaps we find somebody back still home. I wanted to get away from Czechoslovakia, and so I started to learn millinery, to have some sort of trade in my hand.
I had a cousin, Adrian, who was a milliner. She told me one day that she had a very nice young girl, a little bit older than me, but not much, working for her, and was very gifted and very pretty. We met. We did know about each other's plans, maybe, to leave Bratislava. For me, it was just a means to a kind of blotting out what I couldn't get out of myself. I couldn't stop thinking and feeling tremendous guilt that I was alive. And it just became a kind of walking constantly on tombstones. So we had that in common, and I remember when I got my call that my passport is being granted, I could hardly believe my luck. I went to the interview, and who should I see there sitting? The pretty girl that I knew so well. And we sat together, both of us terribly nervous and wondering what was going to happen. I came out having been granted the rubber stamp, which was my first step en route to Australia, waited for Ibi outside, and she came back with a big smile. She also got it. And from that moment on, we realized we have to try and time our exit together, because we were both lone sailors. We managed to remain friends. We had our arguments occasionally, but we were very close. Our weddings were very close.
3 months between us. We met our husbands practically at the same time. We got married 3 months apart. We had our first sons 6 months apart.
Having lost my only sister, I'm so fortunate that in Ibi I have found as close a sister as possibly mine would have been had she lived.
Vice versa.
We've managed to stay good friends over the years that we've lived here. We were very close in touch, and every year had a get-together with those people that traveled with us.
65 years ago, I was telling my family on that gathering at my son's place that we were together as 4 generations of Australians. 4 generations. We just came, the 2 of us, and now we have 4 generations.
Dear survivors, my good friend, Honorable Josh Frydenberg, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends, I would like to thank the NSW Jewish Board of Deputies for kindly allowing the Embassy of Israel to include this important award presentation in the proceeding tonight. This evening, we commemorate the exceptional compassion and bravery of 2 Dutch Australians, Frederick William Corten and his wife, Hermine Charlotte Corten Schiffer. The Cortens have been recognized as righteous among nations, the highest honor that Yad Vashem and the State of Israel can bestow on a Gentile for saving Jews from the terror of the Holocaust. In 1942, in Amsterdam, there was a little girl by the name of Mariana Katwich, or Mary, as she preferred to be known. At this time, Mary's family were notified that they were to be transported to the camp of Westerbork in the Netherlands, with the view that they would be moved from there to a concentration camp in the east of the Third Reich. Before Mary and the family were deported by the Nazis, her uncle organized to transport Mary to The Hague. Mary would be moved again, this time to the Dutch city of Leiden, where she would be taken into the care of 2 remarkable people, Frederick and Hermine Corten. The Cortens would raise Mary alongside their own son, Hans, who is with us today, pretending she was a relative of theirs. The Cortens' unconditional compassion allowed Mary to be plucked from the disastrous fate that so many others, including her own mother, would be subjected to. After the war, her father, he himself a survivor of the death camps, would return for his daughter. She would leave the Cortens' care and go on to live a fruitful, happy life. Before I invite Hans Corten to accept this award for his late parents, I would like to read to you a letter from Will Groen, Mary's husband, to Hans. Dear Hans, on this day of receiving Yad Vashem Righteous Among Nations Award, posthumously for your parents, it is good to look back in time as well as to look forward. The award is well earned by your parents because they saved Mary's life, and we are still grateful for their actions of taking Mary into the home and caring for her. If she would have been deported together with her mother, she certainly would have met her mother's fate and would have been murdered in Sobibor death camp on the 5th of March, 1943. Mary survived and lived a good life after the war in Amsterdam, as well as in Apeldoorn, and gave birth to our son, and later received 2 splendid grandsons. She experienced all this, all because your parents acted as good and righteous human beings in those terrible times. She enjoyed her life, children and grandchildren. I don't know if you realize that this day, the 15th of April, is also Mary's and mine wedding anniversary, as we were married on this day in the year 1957, and it is also the Liberation Day of the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, from which I was freed in 1945. A remarkable day indeed. I'm sorry that Mary did not live long enough to attend this ceremony, because, as you know, she died of an illness in October 1999. My son and I are sorry that we cannot attend this ceremony, but we are with you in our thoughts, and we congratulate you for this honor bestowed on your parents by Yad Vashem and the State of Israel. Yours, will grown. Hans? Yes.
I'll get a phone for this one here.
Hans, please accept, on behalf of Yad Vashem and the State of Israel, this certificate and medallion. Let me show the medallion. And medallion, honoring your parents as righteous among nations.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be here. It is very, very tragic that my parents couldn't accept this reward. My father passed away in 1980, and my mother passed away in 1988. I came to Australia in 1955, and having been back to the Netherlands several times, and every time I went back, I visited Mary and her husband in Apeldoorn, where they lived. I met the son, René, and 2 days ago, I received a phone call from Mary's husband, Wil Groen. He lives now in Amsterdam. I brought with me the thing that I kept when Mary came to us in December 1942. The first thing my mother did was remove the Jewish star from her clothing. And I said to my mother, I'll have that as a souvenir. And she said, no, you won't. If they come and search the house, they'll find it, and then we'll be in trouble too. I said, I promise you, they'll never find it. And they didn't. And this is the souvenir. I have been a guest speaker for a number of organizations in my town that I live now in, Tamworth, New South Wales. And of course, the people you strike in those Australian organizations know absolutely nothing about what happened during the Second World War. This is a photo of Mary as I knew her when she came to us. Mary was then, I think, 3 years younger than me. I was 12 and she was 9. And Mary stayed with us until her father picked her up. My father, at the end of the Second World War in May 1945, he had a lift with a Canadian truck to Amsterdam, to the headquarters of the Dutch Red Cross, where he established the fact that the Jewish girl had been shielded by us during the war, and name and address was supplied just in case somebody came back and asked for it. At that time, of course, we were quite unaware whether her parents would still be alive. And her father came back from the Dutch camp Westerbork, which is in northern part of Holland. The mother, of course, didn't survive. She was transported to Auschwitz. Yes, it has been a period of my life that I remember well. There were a couple of funny things I can tell you. When Mary was staying with us, we were lucky in a way because my father's cousin, who lived in Rotterdam and was bombed out of the house in May 1940, he later on was transported for work in Germany. He worked in the Ruhr area. His wife suffered from tuberculosis, TB. The Germans at the time were very frightened of TB. And his wife was in a sanatorium in the Netherlands. And so the consequent story of Mary staying with us was simple and only her father was working in Germany, her mother was in a sanatorium, and she is staying with us. My father had a contact with a primary school, the head of the primary school, and he asked him, could Mary go to the school? And he said, of course she can. And so Mary was lucky. Nobody knew anything about whatever the real story was. And Mary went to primary school until her father picked her up in January 1946. The funny part sometimes came when there were what they called during the war a razzia. A razzia was a plan that the Germans had developed. You quarter off a part of the town, say 4 or 5 blocks, and then they go like with a fine-tooth comb through the houses to see if there were anybody there, either Jews or alternatively people who were supposed to have worked in Germany, didn't want to go, disappeared from the scene. And those things happened at a monotonous regularity. And of course, when things like that happen, the doorbell rings and this well-educated German SS officer stood there. I'll remember him in his uniform with a white cravat. And I thought, Jesus, he looks well. He came and searched the house, went everywhere with my father. My father showed him the ins and outs of the house, It was a 3-story building in the city of Leiden. And when they come to the top where my room was and Mary's room was, he just sat down on a big basket, which was the basket where my mother put the dirty washing in prior to having the washing. And he said to my father, did he smoke? And Dad said yes, and so they both smoked a cigarette. What the SS men did not know was that in the basket, in the bottom of the basket, underneath the dirty clothing, was the radio my father listened to, the BBC, every evening at 7 o'clock. So he sat with his rear right smack on top of the radio. If you can imagine, when you see things like that, you think, during the Hunger Winter from September 1944 till May 1945, there were several times that a German division or a battalion came for rest in a parkland not far from our house. And Mary and I then went to see if we could scrounge any food from them. And because I was a boy, he told me to nick off. And then he said to Mary, come and sit on my knee, darling, and I'll give you a piece of bread. And I thought, you never knew she was Jewish, did you? That is, in short, the story. Yes, it was a time of my life I'll never forget. And to be totally honest with you, I have often thought, would I do the same as far as my dad was? Because I was only 12. And when Mary came, I think it was 7:05 in the evening in December 1942, and Mom and Dad had told me the story. Would I tell my kids at the age of 12 something that could be a resultant factor that you yourself go into a camp and probably never been heard of? And I don't know the answer to that. Mom and Dad obviously thought I could keep my mouth shut. So thanks, Dad, for thinking that. Thank you.
I light this candle in honor of the righteous among the nations.
rise for the passing song. Oh, please don't go.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my task to draw this evening to a close. There is a tiny Greek island called Zakynthos, whose Jewish community during the Holocaust numbered 275. Towards the end of World War II, German forces arrived on Zakynthos and ordered the mayor, Lucas Carrère, to compile a list of the names and addresses of the Jews on the island. The mayor consulted the Greek Orthodox Bishop Chrysostomos and asked, "How can we hand them over?" Responded the bishop, "We will give them a list." The two of them went to the German commander and handed him two pieces of paper. The first was a letter to Hitler, requesting that the Jews of Zakynthos be left in peace, as they had lived on the island for hundreds of years. The second piece of paper, they told the commander, was the list of names he had requested. On that piece of paper were two names only, their own, Bishop Chrysostomos and Mayor Carrère. The commander cabled Berlin for instructions. The order to deport the Jews of Zakynthos was rescinded, and the Germans withdrew, leaving intact that entire community, plus Bishop Chrysostomos and Mayor Carrère. Our focus tonight has been on the fact that 70 years have elapsed since liberation. 70 years have elapsed since the Holocaust. Yet, where are we in relation to that darkest chapter in our history? The capacity of those so minded to give voice to bigotry and vent to the destruction of others. More importantly, where are we in terms of the capacity of people of goodwill to refuse to look away, to refuse to be bystanders, to speak up when others remain silent, as we heard the remarkable story of the Corton family tonight? The capacity of some to unleash a Holocaust and for others to respond by saying, "We are all Jews," and substitute their names for the innocent. These are questions which we continue to carry 70 years later, questions which we ask today, questions for which there are no easy answers. And yet, given the proliferation of anti-Semitic incidents in countries such as England and France, countries in which Jews have had a presence for hundreds of years, on a continent on which Jews no longer ask whether there will be another attack, but where, on a continent which sees Jews taunted if they walk down the streets in visibly Jewish garb, the same continent which allowed the Holocaust to take place and millions of its inhabitants murdered. And given the reality that a speaker could stand on the streets of this city a few kilometers from where we sit tonight and urge the world to rid itself of the hidden evil of the Jews, there are questions which demand to be asked and answers which cry out to be given. Questions and answers which we avoid at our peril. Wrote scholar Yehuda Bauer, "The horror of the Holocaust is not that it deviated from human norms. The horror is that it did not. What happened may happen again, to others, not necessarily Jews, perpetrated by others, not necessarily Germans. We are all possible victims, possible perpetrators, possible bystanders." And said Albert Einstein, "It is not the evil that people do that worries me. It is that others see the people that evil do and look the other way." We thank Josh Frydenberg and our survivors for sharing their stories with us tonight. We thank the CSG for their enormous efforts, and we thank you all for pausing to mark this important moment. We conclude with the partisan song and the national anthems. Please rise.
mag Juden unser Heid, der Nächte wird verschwiegen in dem Heid, nur dort versammelt wird du Sonn in der Kanor, wie a Parol soll gehen das Lied von dort zu dort, nur dort versammelt wird die Sonn in der Kanor, wie a Parol soll gehen das Lied von dort zu dort. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und mit Blei. Sie ist nicht kein Lied von der Vogel läuft der frei. Das hat der Volk zwischen fallen nicht gewählt. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Ganes in der Hand. Das hat der Volk zwischen fallen nicht gewählt. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Ganes